The stars stretched endlessly across the black void of space, pinpricks of light shimmering against an infinite canvas. The silence was profound, a deafening kind of quiet that seemed to swallow all sound. It was the kind of silence that made people uneasy, even those accustomed to the vast emptiness between worlds. And yet, tonight, something was out there, something ancient, something that had not been seen in millennia. The transport ship, Eris Dawn, drifted through the void, its hull a dull grey against the backdrop of the cosmos. Inside, the crew moved about their tasks, their boots clanging softly against metal floors. They were an eclectic group: scientists, engineers, and adventurers gathered for what was supposed to be a simple cargo run to the edge of the known galaxy. But things had been strange from the start. The ship sensors had picked up an anomaly 3 days ago, a faint signal that seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic frequency. At first, it was dismissed as interference from a nearby asteroid field. But then the signal grew stronger and stranger. It wasn't random static. It was deliberate. A message. "Doesn't make any sense," muttered the communications officer, her brow furrowed as she stared at the data streaming across her monitor. "It's not in any language we've seen before, but it's repeating." The captain stood behind her, arms crossed, his face shadowed by the dim light of the control room. "How close are we to its source?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "An hour away, maybe less," came the reply. "If we stay on course, we'll be right on top of it." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Uncharted space was dangerous enough without chasing mysterious signals. But curiosity was a powerful force, and it drove them forward despite the unease gnawing at their stomachs. In the cargo bay, another scene was unfolding. Among the crates of supplies and equipment sat a massive containment pod, its surface covered in scratches and scorch marks. Inside was the most unusual cargo the crew had ever transported, a creature so rare that its very existence was thought to be a myth. The creature was feline, at least in appearance. Nearly 10 feet long from nose to tail, it was a giant cat with fur as black as the void outside, broken only by faint, glowing patterns that seemed to shift and ripple like liquid starlight. Its eyes were even more striking, a piercing gold that seemed to see straight through you. The crew had nicknamed it Void Paw, though no one knew what it was really called or where it had come from. It had been captured on a distant, uninhabited world, surrounded by ruins that spoke of a long-lost civilization. The scientists believed Void Paw was the key to understanding that ancient race, a relic from a time when humans were still learning to walk upright. But Void Paw was no ordinary animal. It was intelligent, frighteningly so. In the week since its capture, it had studied the crew as much as they had studied it. It watched their every move, its golden eyes tracking them with unsettling focus. It never growled, never hissed, but its silence was far more unnerving than any sound it could make. As the ship neared the source of the signal, Void Paw became restless. It paced its containment pod, its glowing patterns flickering like a warning light. The scientists thought it was reacting to the ship's proximity to the anomaly, but no one could explain why. Then the power cut out. For a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. The hum of the ship's engines disappeared, replaced by the oppressive silence of deep space. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the corridors in a dim red glow. "What just happened?" The captain barked, his voice sharp. "Power systems are down," came the frantic reply from engineering. "We're dead in the water." And then the signal changed. It was no longer a rhythmic pulse. It was a voice. Alien and cold, it echoed through the ship's comm system, speaking in a language no one could understand. The words were harsh and clipped, like the edge of a blade scraping against metal. But even without understanding the meaning, the tone was clear. It was a warning. Void Paw reacted immediately. The massive cat threw itself against the walls of its containment pod, its glowing patterns flaring brighter than ever. It wasn't trying to escape, it was trying to warn them. Before anyone could react, the ship shuddered violently. Something had latched onto the hull, something enormous. The sound of metal groaning under pressure filled the air, and the crew scrambled to regain control of the ship. Out of the viewport, they saw it a vessel unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was sleek and organic, its surface pulsating with an eerie green light. It dwarfed the Eris Dawn, its sheer size making their ship look like a toy in comparison. The alien vessel didn't attack, not immediately. It simply loomed over them, its presence a silent declaration of power. But then, tendrils of light began to extend from its hull, reaching toward the Eris Dawn like probing fingers. Voidpaw roared. It was a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the cargo bay, shaking the walls. The containment pod groaned under the force of its struggles, and the crew knew they couldn't keep it locked up for long. The captain made a split-second decision. "Release it," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "But do it." The pod's restraints released with a hiss, and Voidpaw leapt free. It moved with a fluid grace, its massive form both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It didn't hesitate. The moment it was free, it bolted toward the source of the disturbance, its glowing patterns flaring like a beacon. The crew followed, their weapons drawn, though they weren't sure what good they would do against whatever was out there. They reached the airlock just as the tendrils began to breach the ship's interior, their green light casting eerie shadows across the walls. Voidpaw didn't slow down. It charged straight at the intruding tendrils, its fur bristling and its golden eyes blazing with fury. The alien tendrils hesitated, almost as if they were startled by the creature's presence. And then, all at once, the tendrils attacked. The crew watched in stunned silence as Voidpaw leapt into action, its movements a blur of black and gold. It was faster than anything they had ever seen. It tore through the tendrils with razor-sharp claws, its roars echoing through the corridors. The alien ship reacted violently, its green light intensifying as it unleashed more tendrils, each one more aggressive than the last. But Voidpaw was relentless. It fought with a ferocity that left no doubt in the crew's minds this was not just an animal. This was a guardian, a force of nature that had been unleashed against an ancient enemy. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the alien ship retreated. The tendrils withdrew, and the green light dimmed. The massive vessel drifted back into the void, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Voidpaw stood in the center of the corridor, its fur matted and its glowing patterns flickering faintly. It turned to face the crew, its golden eyes locking onto theirs. For a moment, no one moved. And then the signal returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the alien ship. It was coming from inside the Eris Dawn. The signal was sharper now, almost deafening through the ship's comms. It echoed in overlapping tones, both guttural and high-pitched, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating deep in their bones and pressing against their skulls like a rising wave. The crew stumbled backward, hands clamped over their ears, but the sound kept coming. It was relentless, like it was alive, burrowing into their thoughts and demanding to be understood. The captain shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the signal. Voidpaw's reaction was immediate. The massive feline crouched low, ears flattened against its head, its fur bristling. Its glowing patterns pulsed erratically, brighter than ever before, casting shimmering reflections across the metal walls. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its golden eyes scanning the corridors, searching for something none of them could see. Then, as quickly as it had started, the signal stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving the crew gasping for air and blinking in the eerie silence. But the reprieve was brief. "Captain," the communications officer said, her voice trembling as she stared at her console, "the signal's it's in the ship's systems now." The captain's face darkened. "What do you mean in the systems?" "It's everywhere. Navigation, life support, even the artificial gravity. It's like it's rewriting everything." The gravity flickered as if to punctuate her words, and several crew members stumbled as the floor seemed to shift beneath them. Voidpaw let out a low growl, pacing in tight circles as if it could feel the invisible presence invading their ship. "Shut it down," the captain ordered. "Whatever it is, cut it off." "I can't." The officer cried, panic rising in her voice. It's overriding the controls. I don't even think it's using our systems, it's like it's creating its own. Before anyone could respond, the lights dimmed again, plunging the ship into near darkness. Emergency lights flickered back to life, casting long, flickering shadows. And then came the sound. It started as a faint hum, barely audible over the thrum of the ship's engines. But it grew louder, rising into a strange, rhythmic pattern that echoed through the corridors. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic, almost like breathing. The sound wasn't coming from the comm system. It was coming from deeper within the ship. Voidpaw froze, its ears swiveling toward the source of the noise. The glowing patterns on its body shifted, forming jagged lines that rippled across its fur. Without warning, the creature bolted, racing down the corridor with an urgency that sent a fresh wave of fear through the crew. "Follow it!" The captain barked, motioning for the others to move. They sprinted after Voidpaw, their boots pounding against the metal floor. The sound grew louder as they ran, echoing off the walls and seeming to come from everywhere at once. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. Voidpaw led them to the engine room, where the airlock hissed open to reveal a scene straight out of a nightmare. The heart of the ship was no longer recognizable. The walls were covered in pulsating, organic growths, glowing faintly with the same green light they had seen on the alien vessel. The growths twisted and pulsed, spreading like veins across the room. In the center of it all stood a figure. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in a shimmering, translucent veil that seemed to ripple like liquid. Its limbs were elongated, its movements fluid yet unsettlingly jerky. Its face, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless, save for two glowing orbs that burned like distant stars. The creature turned toward them, and the hum stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that pressed against their ears and made their hearts race. Voidpaw stepped forward, its massive frame tense and its golden eyes locked onto the figure. It let out a low, warning growl, the sound vibrating through the room like a war drum. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised one spindly arm and pointed toward the crew. A wave of energy rippled through the room, and suddenly, the growths on the walls surged toward them, twisting and writhing like living things. The crew scattered, scrambling to avoid the encroaching tendrils. Voidpaw leapt into action, its claws tearing through the organic mass with ease. But for every piece it destroyed, two more took its place. "Fall back!" The captain shouted, pulling one of the crew members away from a tendril that had wrapped around their ankle. "We can't fight this." They retreated into the corridor, sealing the airlock behind them. But the growths didn't stop. They slammed against the door, their green light seeping through the cracks like a living thing searching for a way out. "Captain," the communications officer said, her voice trembling, "that signal. It's not just in the systems. It's in us." The crew turned to her, their faces pale. "What do you mean?" the captain demanded. She held up her wrist, where a faint, green glow was pulsing beneath her skin. "It's spreading. I don't know how, but it's changing us." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just taking over the ship. It was taking over them. Voidpaw growled, its fur bristling as it stepped protectively in front of the crew. The glowing patterns on its body shifted again, forming sharp, angular lines that seemed to pulse in time with the green light. And then the hum returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, drilling into their minds and making their thoughts scatter. The featureless figure appeared again, stepping through the sealed airlock as if it were nothing more than a curtain. Voidpaw lunged, its massive form colliding with the figure in a blur of black and gold. The two beings clashed, their movements almost too fast to follow. But the figure was stronger than it looked, and for the first time, Voidpaw seemed to struggle. The crew could only watch, frozen by the sheer intensity of the battle. The walls around them began to shift, the organic growth spreading further and faster. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the ship itself were alive and suffocating them. And then, just as it seemed Voidpaw was gaining the upper hand, the figure did something none of them expected. It spoke. The voice wasn't like the signal they had heard before. It was clear, resonant, and impossibly deep, reverberating through their very souls. "You are not welcome here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning they couldn't fully grasp. And then everything went dark. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a void. A crushing emptiness that seemed to consume not only their sight, but also their sense of space, time, and even self. The crew stood frozen, unsure if their feet were still planted on the metal floor of the ship or if they were floating in some endless abyss. The hum was gone, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence that seemed alive with potential danger. Someone gasped, and it sounded deafening in the void. "Is everyone still here?" The captain asked, his voice shaking in a way that no one had ever heard before. I think so," a crew member answered, but their voice was disoriented, unsure. A faint light began to flicker in the distance, pulling their focus. It was golden and warm, almost comforting, cutting through the void like a lone star in the night sky. Voidpaw's silhouette appeared first, its glowing pattern shimmering faintly. The massive feline stood still, staring at something beyond the light, its ears pressed flat against its head. "Voidpaw sees something," someone whispered, as though afraid speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment. The crew instinctively moved closer to each other, their fear palpable. Voidpaw growled low, a sound that sent vibrations through the air. Then the golden light flared, brighter and more intense, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light dimmed, they were no longer in the corridor. The crew found themselves standing in what looked like an open field, the ship and its metallic walls replaced by rolling grass that shimmered faintly in the same green hue as the organic growths. Above them, the sky was a swirling mass of colors: violets, golds, and deep blues that shifted like oil on water. "Where are we?" one of the crew asked, their voice trembling. "This isn't real," the captain muttered, scanning the horizon. "It's some kind of projection or manipulation. Stay sharp." Voidpaw took a cautious step forward, its eyes fixed on a point in the distance. The crew followed its gaze and saw something that made their blood run cold. In the distance stood a structure tall, jagged, and utterly alien. It pulsed faintly with the same green glow, its surface shifting as though it were alive. Surrounding it were figures, dozens of them, moving in an eerie, synchronized rhythm. Their forms were indistinct, like shadows given mass, and their movement seemed unnatural, as though they were marionettes controlled by unseen strings. "Those are the same as the one in the engine room," the captain said grimly. "No," whispered the communications officer. "They're different. Look closer." The crew squinted, and that's when they saw it. The shadows weren't just imitations of the figure they had encountered, they were imitations of them. Each shadow bore a twisted resemblance to a member of the crew, their forms distorted and wrong, but unmistakable. "What the hell is this?" someone yelled, backing away. Voidpaw let out a sudden roar, its patterns flaring with an intense, white-hot light. The sound shattered the eerie stillness, and the shadows turned in unison to face the crew. And then they began to move. The shadows surged forward, their movements jerky and unnatural, but alarmingly fast. The crew scrambled, their instincts screaming at them to run, but there was nowhere to go. The open field stretched endlessly in every direction, and the alien structure loomed impossibly far away. Voidpaw leapt in front of them, its massive frame a barrier between the crew and the oncoming swarm. The glowing patterns on its body shifted rapidly, forming symbols and shapes that none of them could comprehend, but that seemed to have a tangible effect on the shadows. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering like flames caught in a sudden gust of wind. But it wasn't enough to stop them. The first shadow reached Voidpaw, and the clash sent shockwaves through the air. The creature's claws raked against the shadow's form, tearing through it, but the shadow reformed instantly, as if it were made of smoke and light. The rest of the swarm pressed forward, and Voidpaw was forced to retreat, herding the crew behind it. Then the voice returned. "You should not have come." It wasn't just in their heads this time. The voice reverberated through the very ground, shaking the alien field and sending ripples through the shimmering grass. The sky above them darkened, the swirling colors condensing into a deep, suffocating black. The alien structure in the distance began to pulse more intensely, the green light spilling out like a beacon. The shadows slowed their approach, as if responding to an unspoken command, and the ground beneath the crew shifted. They stumbled, struggling to keep their footing as the field began to dissolve, the grass disintegrating into fine particles that swirled around them like a storm. Voidpaw growled fiercely, its claws digging into the ground as it braced itself. And then they were falling. The sensation was sudden and violent, their stomachs lurching as the ground gave way entirely. They tumbled through the void, spinning helplessly as the storm of particles swirled around them. The alien voice continued to echo, its tone growing colder, more menacing. "You brought the catalyst," it said. "You brought the key." The crew had no idea what it meant, but the words filled them with a deep, primal dread. When the fall finally ended, they landed hard on a smooth, cold surface. Groaning, they pulled themselves to their feet only to find themselves in a cavernous chamber. The walls were the same pulsating, organic material they had seen on the ship, but this time it was laced with veins of golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object that defied explanation. It was small, no larger than a human head, but its shape was constantly shifting, as though it couldn't decide what form to take. The object radiated a soft, golden light, and the air around it seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible melody. Voidpaw was the first to approach, its glowing patterns dimming as it stepped closer. The crew watched in stunned silence, too afraid to move, as the massive feline sniffed the air around the object. And then the voice spoke again, louder this time, filling every corner of the chamber. "The key is chosen. The balance will break." Before anyone could react, the golden light flared, blinding them. When their vision cleared, the object was gone and Voidpaw was no longer standing on the pedestal. It was floating. The massive feline's body was suspended in the air, its glowing patterns brighter and more chaotic than ever. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, golden light as it let out a deafening roar that shook the chamber. And then it turned to face them. But something was different. Voidpaw's golden eyes were no longer filled with the calm intelligence they had come to trust. They burned with something else entirely, something alien. And when it spoke, its voice was not its own. "The catalyst has been awakened. There is no turning back." The crew stood frozen, their minds racing as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. And then the walls of the chamber began to collapse. The walls of the chamber began to tremble, and the floor beneath the crew's feet cracked open, sending shards of the organic material into the air. The roar from Voidpaw echoed in every direction, as if the creature had become a part of the ship itself, or were something else. The air was thick with a charged energy, and the once shimmering golden light was now a swirling, erratic storm of power. The captain's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he turned to his crew. "Get to the ship, now!" he shouted. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was pointless. They were too far from the ship. And the walls, the entire chamber seemed to be collapsing into the very fabric of reality. But it was Voidpaw's eyes, no longer the calm golden that had always radiated trust, that paralyzed them. The feline's eyes were wild, its fur crackling with energy that pulsed in sync with the golden light surrounding the pedestal. "Voidpaw," one of the crew whispered, but there was no recognition in the creature's eyes. The calm intelligence was gone, replaced by something darker. Something ancient and terrifying. Then the voice spoke again, this time from Voidpaw's very mouth, though it was not the voice the crew had come to know. The tone was cold, distant, and yet filled with overwhelming power. "The catalyst is bound. The cycle will begin anew." Voidpaw's body floated higher, suspended in the air, and the chamber shook violently as though it were about to crumble in on itself. The crew tried to back away, but the walls of the chamber seemed to close in, and the very space around them warped, twisting like the surface of water disturbed by unseen forces. The light from the pedestal was blinding now, casting an otherworldly glow across the room. "Captain," the communications officer said, her voice barely a whisper, "what do we do? How do we stop it?" There was no answer. The captain could feel the pressure building inside his chest, the weight of the situation too immense to comprehend. This was no longer just a battle for survival, it was a fight against something far older, far more powerful than any of them could have imagined. "Voidpaw, listen to me!" the captain shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "We've been through this together. You're not just a weapon. You're more than this. Don't let it take you." But Voidpaw's eyes, still glowing with that fierce, golden energy, remained fixed on the crew, unmoving. It was as if the creature could no longer hear them. And yet, just before it felt like all hope was lost, something flickered in Voidpaw's expression. A slight hesitation. A spark of recognition. The captain took a step forward, his breath shaky but determined. "You're still in there, Voidpaw. Fight it." For a moment, there was stillness and uneasy calm that spread through the room. The golden energy surrounding the feline began to pulse erratically, like a heartbeat struggling to find a rhythm. The walls of the chamber groaned under the pressure, but it was then that the captain saw it, the faintest flicker of Voidpaw's original consciousness behind the golden eyes. Without warning, Voidpaw let out another mighty roar. But this time, it was different. The sound was not one of aggression or command, but of pain, a raw, primal cry that reverberated through the very core of the ship. The walls began to crack further, but the glow around Voidpaw wavered, then flickered, then vanished completely. The feline dropped to the ground, landing gracefully on all fours, its massive frame now just as it had always been, strong, intelligent, and still full of the spark that made it so unique. Its glowing patterns dimmed to a gentle pulse. The ship, however, was far from stable. The chamber was collapsing, and the reality around them continued to warp as though it were no longer anchored in the same dimension. It was clear that whatever force had awakened the catalyst in Voidpaw had now been severed, but the ship, if not the universe itself, was on the brink of collapse. "Voidpaw, can you?" the captain's voice faltered, his eyes searching the felines. Voidpaw let out a low growl, a sound that now carried the weight of something ancient but undeniably grounded in the present moment. The feline slowly turned to face the crew, its golden eyes now calm, as if whatever darkness had taken over had been banished. It was then that the captain understood. Voidpaw wasn't just the key to fighting the alien forces, it was the guardian, the one who had been waiting, holding back the cycle's full force until now. The catalyst wasn't just a weapon, it was the prison, the trigger, and the shield. "Captain," the communications officer said, her voice now tinged with urgency. "It's collapsing. We need to leave now." "Where?" the captain snapped, his gaze darting across the chaos that surrounded them. The chamber was dissolving, the golden light now a fiery storm that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Voidpaw," the communications officer continued, her voice shaky but resolute, "can you open the way?" Voidpaw stared at them, its glowing eyes focused on the captain for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it stepped forward, its paw pressing against the disintegrating floor. A ripple ran through the ground, and the air began to shimmer. The ship's systems, once again under Voidpaw's command, began to hum, the familiar tones of the engines slowly returning to life. The captain didn't hesitate. "Everyone, move!" he shouted. They ran, no longer thinking, only reacting. The ship was breaking apart around them, but Voidpaw, now fully in control, opened a path through the chaos. The walls cracked, but the light that had once threatened to tear everything apart now parted, creating a corridor of stability in the collapsing structure. They reached the control room, the crew pouring into the narrow space. Voidpaw followed them, its massive frame barely fitting inside. With a final, powerful growl, the feline's golden patterns flared one last time. The ship, now fully stabilized, powered back to life. The crew breathed a collective sigh of relief. The ship was intact, but their journey had only just begun. The captain glanced at Voidpaw, who stood in the center of the room, its eyes still glowing faintly with the remnants of the energy it had absorbed. The creature's battle wasn't over. It had fought, it had won, but the cost of victory was unclear. The captain knew that the cycles, the forces at play, were far from finished. What happens now? The communications officer asked, her voice steady but with an underlying tremor. Is this over? The captain turned to her, his expression hard but filled with something new. Something resolute. No. This is just the beginning. The balance may have been shifted, but the fight is far from over. And we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Voidpaw let out a low, almost contented growl, and the golden glow that had once been a sign of impending destruction now seemed like a beacon of hope, a warning and a promise. The ship had survived. But what lay ahead was still unknown. And as the crew braced themselves for the next chapter of their journey, they realized something that could never be taken away from them: humanity's resilience, its ability to survive and adapt, would always be their greatest strength. It was what had led them to this point, and it would carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. The captain looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, the endless expanse of space stretching before them. The unknown, the great mystery of it all, awaited. And though the threat had been temporarily subdued, the knowledge that it could return loomed large. But they would be ready. With Voidpaw by their side, they had learned one undeniable truth: even the most terrifying forces in the universe could be challenged, and humanity, together with their extraordinary allies, could face whatever was coming. For now, that would be enough. And with that, the ship began its journey into the vast, uncharted space once more, a symbol of hope, strength, and the unyielding spirit of survival.